Hi, my name is Lee Warren with Prospect Inspectors. I'm a licensed professional inspector, licensed by the Texas Real Estate Commission. In Texas, all home inspectors must be licensed through the Texas Real Estate Commission, which is the same entity that licenses real estate agents and brokers as well as home warranty companies and a number of other deals. Appraisals also fall into a slightly different category, but still governed through TREC. But today what we're going to talk about is the inspection report itself. Now, many investors may not get inspections on properties, but whether you're flipping or going to buy it and rent, to rent out, whatever the case may be, you'll probably deal with an inspector or an inspection report at some point. On the seller's disclosure notice that comes from the Texas Association of Realtors, there's a question on there that asks if there's been an inspection done on a property within the last 4 years. And if there is, you have to disclose that. So if you're purchasing a property and the seller has had an inspection done on it in the last 4 years, they should disclose that. Or if you had done the inspection, had an inspection done when you were purchasing it and then going to turn around and flip it, you need to disclose that too. So whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side, you're probably going to deal with an inspection and an inspection report in some way, shape, or form, somewhere along the line. So we provided a link or an attachment which will have the actual copy of the inspection report. And if you'll notice, the report itself is only 6 pages long. This is the real basic version of the report. The Real Estate Commission dictates the form that we have to use. You'll see on the bottom left-hand corner, there'll be a 7-5. That is the actual version of the form that we'll be using. That is the most current form as it stands. It's about 2.5 years old. We're currently at the Real Estate Commission going through a process of reevaluating the form. It usually takes about a year or two to complete. But as of right now, the 7-5 is the most recent form to be used. The first 2 pages of the report are limitations, what the purpose of the inspection is, client and inspector responsibilities, just so everything is clear. It also goes over a number of deficiencies and hazards in a home, and it's commonly referred to as the OPI, but the first 2 pages of the report pretty much are standard. They can't be changed. Inspectors have to have that first 2-page verbatim exactly the way it is, right up until that last section where it says additional information provided by the inspector. The inspector cannot modify those first 2 pages at all. As far as the subsequent 4 pages, those are the actual meat and bones of the actual inspection itself. It's broken down into 6 sections. The first one is the structural systems, then the electrical, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, plumbing systems, appliances, optional systems, and those are your 6 main areas. The first 5 are required. The last section, the 6th, the optional systems, are exactly what they state. They're optional. Not every inspector does them. Not every inspector is qualified to do them, but they don't have to do them. And often, most inspectors will charge an additional fee to inspect those optional items. Those optional items include pools, spas, sprinklers, outbuildings, septic systems, wells, so on and so forth. Typically, those are not required items for the inspector to inspect, and they can and may charge an extra fee for that, or may just not inspect that system at all. We'll go over the other 5 sections in a little more detail though. On the report, you'll see along the left-hand side of the report, you'll see 4 check boxes. Every line item has to have one of those items checked. There's inspected, not present, and deficient. Inspected, pretty straightforward, whether the inspector actually inspected that system or not. Not inspected, also just as obvious. Not present, and then deficient. Deficient is where you get into a little bit of a gray area. The inspectors are required to follow what's called a standards of practice, meaning there's a set minimum standards that we as inspectors must follow with every single inspection that we perform. If any of the items within our standards of practice qualify as being deficient, the inspector must mark that deficient box. Just because something is deficient does not mean that it has to be repaired. But also keep in mind, these reports are legal documents. They're written as such. They're typically very dry, very direct. So if you're just looking at the report, it can be a little daunting. Most of the inspection reports are not going to be 6 pages like you see here. They're going to have a lot more information and data in there, including most inspectors will put pictures. The inspection reports for my company typically run about 25 to 30 pages, but every inspector varies based on how many pictures they put in the report, how much content they put in, if they put graphics in that may describe a certain thing that they're trying to convey to their client. The First section that we'll talk about is the structural system. And number one on everybody's list, especially in Texas, is foundations. There are two types of foundations in Texas. Foundations that have problems and foundations that will. It is just a matter of time. The house will move around. Whenever you build houses on top of large sponges, that's pretty much what's going to happen. It's going to move around on you. Coincidentally, the foundation is the one thing that the state tells us as inspectors we're required to give our opinion on. So as opposed to electric, plumbing, HVAC, where we can say this is right or this is wrong, the foundation is we have to actually give an opinion of performance, whether we feel that it's performing within its intended purpose or not. And this can cause a little bit of confusion, especially on the consumer side. What it really breaks down to is if the inspector looks around the house, inside, outside, feels the floors, looks up in the attic and the rafters and the structural systems of the house, and feels like there's some adverse performance on the foundation that could be an issue as far as that may need repair, the inspector is going to say, probably refer you to a structural engineer to further evaluate that system, because a licensed structural engineer is the only one that can really tell you if the foundation needs to be repaired or not. A licensed home inspector is not allowed to tell you. That goes beyond the scope of what an inspection actually is. There are some houses that are pretty obvious, but in the end, the inspector's purpose as far as the foundation goes is just to refer you to a structural engineer if he feels, in his opinion, that there's some adverse performance conditions there that may at some point warrant some foundation repair. So grading and drainage is your next section that's there. The reason this is vitally important because water is one of your biggest culprits in foundation movement. So if you have one area of the house that stays saturated, it's going to heave the soil up and push up against the house. But if you have another area of the house that stays really dry, where the drainage is really good, it'll go down. So that teeter-totter movement is a big part of what can cause foundation problems. Plumbing leaks are also another one. So you always want the slope, the grade from the house to go nicely and evenly away from the house. At the bare minimum, you should have at least 6 inches down for every 10 feet horizontal away from the house. Any less than that, you could start getting excessive moisture sitting at the house and swelling of the foundation. You can get too much sometimes, and if you have too much slope, you may need to have a retaining wall or some other means to hold the soil in place so that it doesn't erode around the side of the structure. Having foliage too close to the house, those types of things, areas where water pools up, if the gutters drain right next to the house instead of draining farther away, those are all issues that will have an effect on the grading and drainage of the house and will be mentioned in this section of the report. Roof covering. Roof covering is another big one that people associate your high dollar repairs with. And in about every 7-10 years, most people are going to get a new roof because Mother Nature is going to give you one with hailstorms that are out here. But the inspector is required to climb on the roof as part of the minimum standards of practice. If the inspector does not regularly go up on the roof, then he must tell his client at the first substantive contact with them. For instance, if you have an inspector that states that they only inspect the roof via drone, that is not acceptable as far as Trek standards are concerned, and he must disclose that at the first contact with his client to let his client know that he will not be walking on the roof. Now, there are certain situations once you get out to a house, if the steep of the roof is just too high, or there are unsafe conditions, or there's ice, any number of those factors, the inspector can make a safety or judgment call at that point and state for safety reasons he's not going to go on the roof. He does not have to close that at the first contact. The only time he has to disclose it at first contact is if he regularly does not go on a roof. So be careful of that. Asking questions of your inspector is always a really good thing as well. But the inspector is going to go up and look at the shingles themselves, the flashing that's up there, all the roof penetrations, the plumbing vent pipes, the flue pipes from the water heater and or the central heat and air system, the ventilation that's up there, and all those factors to determine what deficiencies may exist on the roof and what possible repairs may be needed as a result. Roof structure and attic, as you move your way down into the house, inspector should be going into the attic to look at the actual roof decking from the underside, the rafters, ridge beams, all the insulation that's in there to give you a good idea of if the structure itself appears to be holding or if there's possible foundation movement that could be causing structural deficiencies. The more your foundation moves on the bottom of the house, it will show itself the higher you go. So it's very common in a house that has had a lot of foundation issues or a lot of movement where the rafters that come up at the very top of the roof will start pulling away and separating, and that's a good indication that there may be some movement going on underneath the house. Walls, interior and exterior, whether cracks, water stains, previous sheetrock repairs, evidence of other types of repairs that may have been there, both on the inside and the outside. Inside, not always easy to tell, depending on how good the sheetrock work was done on the inside. Outside is usually pretty easy to tell, especially if it's a masonry exterior, brick, stone, something of that nature, because it's very hard to match mortar color when it comes to a lot of repairs that are done. So you can usually see if there's been some repairs that have been done in there. When it comes to cement board siding, which is also very popular, it's not as easy to see that, especially if they've taken all that cement board siding off and redone it. It can be a lot harder to see those repairs. Keep in mind that an inspector is only going to report on the things that he can see. Inspectors are not allowed to remove wall coverings, drill holes in anything, remove anything that isn't a standard panel cover for an equipment. So though we can't really see behind walls, we're going to make the best, we're going to look for all the indicators that will give us the best knowledge about what's going on in and outside of the house. Ceilings and floors, which we just talked about, is the same as the walls. We're looking for water stains, sheetrock repairs, stuff of that nature. Floors, whether they're level, they have cracks in them, whatnot. The hard part with floors is 9 times out of 10, the floor is covered. It's covered with hardwood, it's covered with tile, it's covered with carpet, any number of those things, which is going to limit the ability for the inspector to actually see those items. Doors and windows. Doors and windows will also tell you a lot of structural moving that's going on. That's why they're in this section. If doors are out of square, windows are really tight to open, those types of things, that can be a pretty good indicator that there's been some structural movement, so the inspector will discuss that. Interior and exterior doors, because they are treated a little differently. Windows, one of the common things that gets called out on windows is bad thermal seals. So if you've ever seen a window, it's got a little fogging up on the inside of it, that's because the thermal seal between the 2 panes of glass has been penetrated. And it's really just an energy efficiency issue. There's the seal between the 2 panes of glass is no longer there, so the window is no longer as energy efficient as it used to be. You can replace the window, but it's really not the glass that's causing the problem. It's the frame of the window itself that as the house moves around, it starts popping that frame a little bit, and now your moisture starts getting in there. So there's what I typically tell people is there's two main issues with it. You lose a little bit of energy efficiency and it annoys the daylights at it because you can't clean the inside of the glass. Other than that, there's really not that big of an issue with bad thermal seals. If you're just concerned about the energy side, throw a solar screen on the outside, you'll get the energy efficiency back at a fraction of the cost of replacing the glass. If it starts getting a little more cloudy and really white or opaque to where you really can't see through it, then you may want to consider replacing the glass. But just know that when you replace the glass, it's the frame that's causing the problem. In another 10 or 15 years, you're going to probably run into the same issue. Stairways, we're looking for interior and exterior, looking for spacing of the vertical balusters, the height of the handrail, the tread depth. The tread depth is what your foot actually sits on, and the riser is how high each step is. And there are actual codes that we have to follow to let you know if those dimensions exceed or are short of those requirements. If you've ever gone up a set of stairs and there's one step where you just kind of catch your foot on, you aren't sure why, it's probably because it's about a ½ an inch higher or lower than what the standard is supposed to be. And the problem you run into is your mind is already trained as to how to go upstairs, and your mind automatically lifts your leg a certain level to go to the next step, and if those are off, it becomes a trip hazard. So that's why we have to call those out, because people will instinctively trip if those height variations are too much. The fireplaces and chimneys, a lot of gas fireplaces around here. One of the big little nitpicky issues that inspectors tend to find is that the gas pipe coming in through the side is not sealed where it goes through the exterior wall. That's supposed to be sealed with a fire retardant material so that if there's a gas leak, it can't go back behind the wall. Pretty common, to miss, but we're also going to look up in the flue as far as we can see with our naked eye and just see if there's any debris or visual signs of creosote, bird nests, anything of those types of items that can cause a safety issue when trying to run the fireplace. Porches, balconies, carports. Your big issue here is people that have added things on after the fact. A lot of people will have a nice, big, beautiful wood deck, and it's sitting right on top of the soil. The problem is wood is absorbent. It'll wick up that water and eventually deteriorate that deck. Plus, it's a conducive condition for termites. So that's one of the things that we're looking for is it properly supported up off the ground? Is it properly connected to the structure itself? The arbor that got installed on top of the roof, did it actually get connected to the roof properly, or is it allowing some moisture penetration to come in? So those are the kind of things we're looking for there. The other part is typically you'll see sidewalks and retaining walls be included in that other section that's there, although that can be anything that the inspector feels falls into another category, but as it relates to structural systems. So those are your structural systems. The next section is electrical. Two main areas here, one the panel itself, and then two the wiring. So the panel in and of itself, there are three panels that people tend to hear about the most that give them a moment of pause or give them concern. The Federal Pacific Stab Lock panel, the Zinsco, and the Sylvania panel. There are documented reports of failures in those particular types of panels. And it does not mean that those panels have to be replaced. I have seen a number of quote-unquote experts, not licensed electricians, mind you, but quote-unquote industry experts that say if you see any of those panels, they have to be replaced. That is not necessarily the case. If an inspector sees that, they're going to red flag it. They're going to tell their client to go ahead and have it evaluated by a licensed electrician. There were a couple of different problems with those panels that caused the big scare of what's happening. One of the issues was typically when you have too many amps running through a circuit, the breaker will trip, stop the power flow, and keep things from overheating or causing a fire. Some of the breakers in these particular types of panels, they would trip, but the power flow wouldn't actually stop. So whatever was causing the problem was allowed to continue, and that's how some of these fires started. There were also some of these breakers that would overheat and they would actually melt onto the bus bar and fuse themselves onto the bus bar, thereby creating another fire hazard as well. So one thing to keep in mind, there are thousands of these panels all over Dallas-Fort Worth, and houses are not bursting up into flames. But if you do have one of these panels in your home or a home that you're looking at the very least, have a licensed electrician come through and take a look at it. They can test the individual breakers to determine if the panel itself falls under the recall category of what was out there by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or if it's just one or two breakers that may need to be addressed, or if there's no repairs needed at all. But only a licensed electrician is going to be able to make that determination. Aluminum wiring is another big concern that people tend to have with a house. Aluminum wiring in and of itself is perfectly fine. It's a great conductor of electricity. The problem you run into with aluminum wiring is it's very expansive. When you run power through a circuit, it heats up. When it heats up, it expands. And aluminum has a very high expansion and contraction rate. Copper has a much lower expansion and contraction rate. If you have aluminum in a house, you do not have to replace all the wiring in the house. You just have to treat the aluminum connections properly. You can't connect aluminum wiring to brand new outlets that are designed to be connected with copper. There's a thing called pigtailing. I'm trying to find a better word for that, but pigtailing is a way to connect your aluminum and your copper wires to run copper straight to the new outlets. The English version of that is you have aluminum wire coming in from the electrical panel. You connect a very short piece of copper wire to that aluminum, and then this copper wire connects to the outlet. That way the outlet is only connected to copper wire. And there's a special type of connections with some antioxidant compound that you have to use for that copper versus aluminum connection to make sure it does not oxidize. But you can have aluminum in a house running perfectly fine and perfectly safe. You don't have to replace all the aluminum in the house, but you do have to ensure that the aluminum is connected properly. There have to be specific breakers that are rated to be used with aluminum. You have to have specific types of connectors and antioxidant compound. So a licensed electrician can go over these things with you, but just because there's aluminum in a house does not mean all the wiring has to be replaced. It has to be treated a lot more delicately, but it doesn't have to be replaced by any means. Other things we're looking for as far as the branch circuits are concerned is all the outlets. The inspector will test a substantial number of outlets in the house to determine if there's open grounds, if the wires are crossed, anything of that nature. They'll also test ground fault circuit interruption, also known as GFCI, in your kitchens, bathrooms, garage, exterior, in those locations, and the laundry now. AFCI, which is arc fault circuit interruption. It started about 2003 being required in all the bedrooms, and as of 2009 it was required in most other circuits in the house. Arc fault circuit interrupters basically test the circuit to determine if there's anything that can cause an arc or spark anywhere along there. And if it does, it will trip the breaker. One of the downfalls of it is arc fault circuit interrupter breakers don't typically work well with older wiring. So if you're trying to retrofit an older house with a newer panel and try to put arc fault breakers on there, you run the risk they're probably going to trip because it sees the inconsistencies of older wiring as an issue, and it will trip those breakers. So talk to your electrician. You may run into some problems if you have an older house and trying to convert it to some arc fault breakers and those types of items. Moving on to HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Not everybody knows what HVAC stands for, so I just try to spell that out. There are four main components to essentially an air system. There is a blower fan, which does exactly what you think it does. All it does is a big, just blows air. That's all it is. The heat exchanger, which if it's a gas system, you'll have a gas furnace blowing in there, or it could be a heat pump system, as well as emergency heat will also factor into that. But your heat exchanger, which is basically where the heat goes on, the blower blows air across the heat exchanger. That's what heats air into the house. Your air conditioning system typically has two main parts: your condenser coil, which is outside, and your evaporator coil, which is upstairs in the attic or in the closet. The condenser coil condenses a freon to a liquid state, sends it back up into the evaporator coil. As air blows across the evaporator coil, it evaporates the freon, which turns it extremely cold, and that's what cools the air off as it goes back into the house. The evaporated freon goes back down to the condenser to be recondensed back into freon. And that goes in a circle, and that's how your air conditioning works. With a heat pump system, that same process for air conditioning is what's going on, except it's in reverse. So it heats instead of cools. But that's your main difference on those. The filter is the cheapest, quickest, easiest thing you can do to make that unit last a lot longer. And it's the one thing everybody forgets. And it is also one of the big things that almost always ends up on every report is that the filter is dirty. A dirty filter can affect the airflow substantially on a unit to where it will cause the heater to turn off and on and off and on. It's called short cycling. It can also cause a really high temperature differential with your air conditioning system. And to explain that, temperature differential is what is the temperature going into unit versus what has actually come back out. How much is it actually lowering the temperature in air conditioning mode? The ideal number is about 20. Most inspectors are going to give about a 16 to 21 degree temperature range as an acceptable range, but anything outside of that, they're probably going to call out and recommend a licensed essentially an air technician. If it's overcooling, one of the common reasons for that is the filter is really dirty, or there's a kink or obstruction in the duct so that there's not enough air coming through. And that will actually cause an overcooling of the air, which is a bad thing. If you have a house that's been doing that for a long time, if you look up at the vent registers in the ceiling, typically you'll see a lot of rust and or evidence of moisture around there because the temperature difference is so high trying to come back into the room, it's causing condensation on that metal vent register. Typical reason for low temperature differential is if the freon is low, something of that nature. So that's a pretty common one. Once you start getting into the newer units, the type of refrigerant has changed. So if you're trying to take an old unit to a new unit, you may not be able to just replace one component of it as you used to be able to do with the old Freon systems. You may have to actually replace the whole system. Freon used to be about $5 or $6 a pound. Now it's 70 or 80 bucks a pound. The government's bumping the price up on that because they're trying to get everybody out of using the R22 Freon to the newer Puron systems. So just keep in mind with HVAC, as you have to replace them, your costs may go up a bit because you'll probably have to start replacing more components than you're used to if you've been doing this previously. Plumbing system, you have two main systems to your plumbing. You have your water supply, which is under pressure. We're looking for anything between 40 and 80 pounds per square inch on the pressure side. Anything outside of that range can cause problems in a multitude of different areas, but 40 to 80 is the range that we're looking for. And your drain system. So the water comes in through the supply, goes out through the drains. Everything on the drain system is all gravity fed. So it's pretty easy as an investor to see if you have a leak in the pressure system. You can go out to the meter with everything off and see if the meter is spinning up. If the meter is spinning up while everything's off, that means there's something open. There's some way that water is getting out through the system. Usually means a water supply line leak. Could be a leaky faucet, tub, toilets running, something of that nature. It could be something more serious like a leak under the slab, but usually it's a toilet or a sink or something of that nature. To test the drains, that can get a little more complicated. The best way to test the drain system is to do what's called a static pressure test on the system. A licensed inspector is not allowed to do this. Only a licensed plumber can do a static pressure test. Furthermore, if you do a static pressure test on a house that you're purchasing, Texas requires that you get separate written permission from the seller in order to perform that static pressure test. The Real Estate Commission is actually working on a form as we speak. It should be available by May 1st that actually has the seller authorization for a static pressure test. The static pressure test itself means they're plugging all the drain lines, they fill them all up with water, and they go away for a certain period of time. They come back and they see if that water level has dropped in any way, shape, or form. If it stayed the same, you know there's no leaks in the drain lines. If it has moved downward at all, it means the water is escaping somewhere into the system, usually through a leak. Most commonly, you'll see this on a house that's had foundation repair. And most reputable foundation companies will do a static pressure test to ensure that when they lifted the house and stabilized it, that they did not break those drain lines or the water supply lines while they were doing it. So if you had a house that has had foundation repair, check the warranty information or the repair information to determine if they actually did a static pressure test. If they didn't do a static pressure test on that system after the foundation repair, I would highly recommend doing that yourself and making sure that gets done, because a drain line leak underneath the house can be quite costly. We're looking for the drains not only from an inspection side. We're looking at the drains that we can actually see, the sink drains, where the appliances connect to, tubs, faucets, commodes, those types of things. We're looking for leaks, any evidence of moisture penetration in those areas, under sinks, loose tile around the showers, shower heads that leak, hot and cold reversed, a number of those little quirky things. With investors, most investors don't worry too much about a lot of these, because a lot of what inspectors are going to call out are going to be loose faucet handles, drain stops that don't work, caulking that's needed, shower head that leaks. And a lot of times with investors, you're going to end up redoing a lot of the plumbing there anyway. You're going to remodel the bathroom, so it's not as much of an issue. So when you're reading through a report, you have to kind of glaze over some of the things that you may not be all that concerned with. As inspectors, we have to put it in there. Regardless, if you as the investor tell the inspector, I'm going to remodel all these bathrooms, it's not going to matter. They're still going to put that stuff in there. So just understand that kind of right off the bat. The water heating, hydro massage equipment also falls into this. Water heaters, typically your tanked water heaters last about 10 to 12 years on average. But we as inspectors have to call out a number of things. We are not going to say how long the life expectancy of it is in the form, as I've seen water heaters that last 5 years and they've just completely die. I've seen other ones that have lasted over 30 years and are still working just fine. A lot of it has to do with maintenance and the amount of mineral content in the water system itself. So there are a number of different factors that can contribute to how long a water heater will come or go. There is typically a valve called a TMP, a temperature pressure relief valve, that is either on the top of the unit or along the side within like the 6 inches of the top. And that valve is a safety valve. It opens up if the pressure builds up too much or if the temperature gets too close to boiling the water. That valve will open up and release to the outside. That is what keeps the water heater, if it malfunctions, from blowing through your roof. An inspector we're required to test that valve unless we feel that it is a safety concern to not do that. And to explain that a little bit better, most inspectors are going to put a little bit of pressure on that valve to see if it opens freely. If it does, then great, it's working okay. If we have to put too much pressure on it, most inspectors are going to stop, because it probably means there's some mineral deposits that have solidified in that valve. And if we force it open, we may not be able to get it closed properly. So each inspector is different, but a lot of them will try to at least open it up with some reasonable pressure. But that valve is important. Even on a 5-year-old unit, I've seen them lock up because of so many mineral deposits in the water. But I've seen 20 or 30-year-old units where they still open up just fine. A lot of times, if that's one of the only things that the inspector calls out, you can replace just the valve without replacing the entire water heater itself. Tankless units are great. They've started coming into play out here about 10 or 12 years ago, and I haven't seen a tankless unit really fail due to corrosion and whatnot yet. So as far as ascertaining a decent lifespan on a tankless unit, I can't really give one as of yet. But tankless units are very, very efficient, very energy efficient. It's nice to never run out of hot water. One of the things that I'm seeing on newer houses right now is they're putting the water heaters on the outside wall, which is all fine and dandy, except they need to remember to insulate the water lines out there because it will freeze and it can break. And where the lines go through the bottom of the panel, they need to make sure that they actually seal that up. So if there is a leak, the water will come outside the panel and outside the exterior wall, not in between the two walls. So the inspector will comment on the age of the unit if it can be ascertained through the labels that are there, the size of the unit, and the energy source in which that's powering the water heater. So just some of those things to keep in mind. The hydro massage therapy equipment is usually the Whirlpool tubs, the tub that everybody loves to have and has to have but never actually uses. And 9 times out of 10, there's no access panel to get to the motor, which they're supposed to be, but a lot of times they forget that. And then there's supposed to be a GFCI protection specifically on that tub itself. Sometimes it's in the bathroom, like in the bathroom closet, along the bathroom closet wall, or sometimes it'll actually be in the electrical service panel itself. So sometimes you'll just have to kind of look for it. And if the unit doesn't work, more than likely that's probably what's going on. The GFCI has tripped somewhere, but nobody really realized where it was. Moving on to appliances. The appliances are your 5th section, and they are dishwashers, food waste disposers, range hoods, ranges, ovens, microwaves, exhaust fans, garage door operators, dryer exhausts, and other. So most of those are pretty self-explanatory. Most of the appliances, you're gonna know, we're gonna run them through a full cycle. The dishwasher, we're looking for to make sure it's actually secured into place, see if the racks and rollers are working okay, if the soap dispenser opens, if it has an anti-siphon loop where it connects, where the drain line connects to the garbage disposal, so on and so forth. Most of these things are pretty easily fixable on deficiency items, but occasionally you'll get one that will leak on you. Garbage disposals, most of them are going to have a little bit of corrosion because metal in water is just going to corrode over time, just inevitable. One thing you got to watch for the garbage disposal is where the electrical wire comes in through the bottom. There's supposed to be a little clamp on there to hold it in place. And a lot of people that install these themselves, they forget that little clamp, and the problem you run into is that's a sharp edge where that electrical line goes in, and every time you turn the unit on, it vibrates, and you run the risk that it's going to cut that cord. So you be careful of that. Range hood, if the vent hood is over a gas range, it really should go to the exterior. There is no code that specifically states that, so builders will still do that on new homes. They'll actually just use a recycling air vent hood. But when it's over a gas range, it really should go to the outside. The gas that you run through a gas range is the same gas runs through your fireplace, same gas runs through your central heat and air system, and your same gas runs through your water heater. All of those have to be vented to the outside. Your vent hood should as well. Plus, the downfall with the vent hood is what gas it's trying to get rid of is not clean gas. It's got food and everything else all over it, as opposed to your central heat and air or your water heater, which are in their closed combustion chambers. So the amount of debris that gets on those is pretty minimal, but the amount of debris that gets on your range is pretty excessive. So those really should vent to the outside. Sometimes it's practical, sometimes it's not, but just something to kind of keep in mind. Most inspectors are going to call that out if it's a gas range and it doesn't actually vent to the exterior. Microwave ovens. Test to make sure the actual plate turns all the way around, that it's actually securely mounted into place. There's a lot of times where people will install the vent hoods and they're really loose. They just kind of slid them in there and you can pull them out by hand. So just got to be careful of that. The exhaust fans and bathroom heaters, most inspectors are not going to test the gas wall, the old style gas wall heaters in the bathroom because they are a safety hazard because they have no way of venting to the outside. And they can catch things on fire, clothes, people put towels right in front of them and those types of things all the time. Exhaust fans are required in the bathrooms and the laundry room. And a lot of times they are not vented properly. They should be vented all the way through the roof, not out to the soffits and not into the attic. Based on when the house was built, it may have been acceptable at that time, but by today's standards, you're supposed to actually, those exhaust fans are actually supposed to vent all the way through the roof. When you vent out to the soffits, the problem with that is the soffit vents are designed to bring air in. So your moisture is trying to go out, but you're actually pushing air back in. It's just going to go right back into the attic and put moisture back in the attic. So they really should vent out to the roof. Dryer exhaust, we're looking for the material, the length of the pipe, whether there's debris in there, so on and so forth, and those types of items. Your optional systems, I'll go over those briefly, just sprinkler systems, swimming pools, outbuildings, private water wells, and septic systems. Like I said, most of those, a lot of inspectors probably won't do. There is a specific license for irrigation companies to do sprinkler systems. There is separate certification for septic systems and wells. So if you have somebody that is going to inspect those systems, definitely find out what their credentials are and find out if they are properly trained in order to test those or inspect those systems properly. So the report itself, if you just look at what you got in your attachment, is just 6 pages. But just keep in mind, very, very rarely will an inspection report ever be only 6 pages. We are required as inspectors to follow this template. We cannot lower the font size in any way, shape, or form. We can make it bigger, but we can't make it smaller. We can't change the order of any of these items that are in here, and that's done to keep it extremely consistent across the board. There are many states that do not license home inspectors. Texas has the strictest requirements for inspectors of any state in the entire country. I actually sit on the Inspector Advisory Committee for the Texas Real Estate Commission. I'm the vice chair of that committee. We are the committee that makes the rules for all inspectors throughout the state. So we are constantly trying to update this to make it, to educate the consumer as best as possible and to keep it as consistent as possible. So every inspector anybody who does a home inspection in Texas must be licensed through the Texas Real Estate Commission. If they are not, they can be fined by the Texas Real Estate Commission for $5,000 or sometimes even $10,000, depending on what the case may be. But always look, if you get a report from a seller or somebody gave you the report as part of the seller's disclosure, look at when the date of the inspection. Find out how long ago that was done, because things can change very, very quickly in a house. If you have somebody who had the inspection report, they've given it to you and they've told you that they've done all the work, make sure you get all the receipts. In Texas, there are 3 main licenses: plumbers, electricians, and HVAC. There's no licensing for roofers, no licensing for builders, foundation repair companies, any of those. So be very careful when you get receipts to find out if that they actually use licensed personnel for those. If you're under contract in a house and you do a repair amendment for certain repairs to be done, the 1-to-4 family contract from TREC specifically states that you have to use licensed people to do it. You can't have a handyman come and replace outlets and change a breaker out. You have to use a licensed electrician. So if it falls into plumbing, electric, HVAC, or sprinklers, you have to use licensed people for those, and you have to supply those receipts as part of your repair amendment. If you don't, you are in violation, you are in breach of your agreement, and they can hold you accountable for that way as well. So if you ever have any questions as it relates to the inspection reports, anything that may come up on them, deviations from the reports, how they're structured, or even suggestions on how we might make it clearer for consumers, please feel free to let me know. You can contact me through Propelio, and if you have any other questions, please feel free to let me know. And if you have any other topics that you'd like from an inspection standpoint to be discussed, or any of these items in more detail, please feel free to let me know. Thank you for joining us.